I will say right away this is not a new series on the Vietnam War. I have received emails from several subscribers asking me to concentrate on the current series rather than starting a new one. So no worries, this is not a new series on the Vietnam War. This is just a standalone video. But from time to time, if I have something interesting to share with you on another subject, I will do just that. By the way, I will place these types of videos under the section Other Videos, which is at the bottom of my channel page. The reason I am making this video is to share some discussions I have had with a few Vietnam veterans over the years. I have taken extensive notes on everything they told me. I find that talking to veterans, you learn far more about a particular war than you do from any book. And that's why it's always far more interesting to talk to combat veterans who experienced the war firsthand. My interest has always been with the individual soldier. So in this video, I will share some of the stories and experiences they related to me in Vietnam. Before we get to that, I will give you a very brief background on the Vietnam War. Now, although the Vietnam War technically started in 1955, the war really started to escalate in 1961. And the war, of course, ended with the fall of Saigon in 1975. Now, a draft had to be instituted because most young American men did not want to have anything to do with the Vietnam War. The primary way the draft worked was through the days of the year. So all of the days of the year were written on slips of paper and then placed in separate plastic capsules. So basically, if your birthday was on January 3rd and the number 3 was drawn, that meant you had been drafted. Now, if that was the first capsule selected, that meant you would start basic training in just a few weeks. The farther down the line that your birth date was selected, the less chance you had of ever going to Vietnam. My uncle remembered watching the draft on live television. He told me his number had still not been selected by the time he went to bed, so he did not have to worry about going to Vietnam. Now, every soldier was expected to serve 1 year in Vietnam, and this was called the tour of duty. Before 1968, it was common to go over to Vietnam and not fire a single shot during your entire tour. There were some battles and incidents, but they were very isolated. 1968 changed all of that. The Northern Vietnamese Army launched the Tet Offensive, and as you can see on this map, that occurred in all directions, literally every area. So it was not uncommon for anyone that arrived after 1968 to be involved in daily skirmishes. And with that, the casualties dramatically increased, and the Vietnam War started to become very unpopular in the United States. So that's really the key to understanding the Vietnam War. Everything before Tet and everything after Tet. Okay, the first veteran I talked to was Gil. Gil told me something many other veterans have told me as well, and that is for years he was unable to talk about Vietnam. It has only been in the last few years that he was able to start talking about his experiences in the war. Gil was drafted into the U.S. Army and arrived shortly after the Tet Offensive. This, of course, was unlucky for him because, once again, if you arrived before Tet, it was common to serve your entire tour there and see no action. I asked Gil what the patrols were like. He said it was extremely grueling. He was on patrol most of the day. In fact, he indicated he did so much walking that he has never been in better shape. He said they would break for a short lunch. In the evening, his patrol came back to the base camp for dinner, and then they went back out yet again. Late at night, they would set up an observation post. He said for a portion of the night, you were required to be on watch. In terms of his patrol, he said usually only lieutenants accompanied him. Everyone with the rank of captain or higher pretty much stayed in the base camp. So it was always good to be a ranking officer. After all, who wants to go out and fight? Gil told me these base camps were huge, almost like a small city. Some were a mile long. Now on patrol, it was just normal rations, but the food at the base camp was better. I did ask Gil if he ever saw a commanding general. He said, yep, in a helicopter above, and that was the closest he ever got to the general. I also inquired about the weather, and he told me it was pretty rough. The rain was continuous. Gil remembered that he had always been a light sleeper, but that after an entire day's patrol, he was so exhausted he was amazed to find he had no problem falling asleep, even in the driving rain. He also remembered one time waking up in a pool of water, and that shocked him that he could fall asleep in conditions like that. One thing I was curious about were his interactions with the villagers and locals. Gil said he talked to them and many were friendly. The commanders told his platoon never to take or accept anything from the locals, but that was largely ignored. One time a young kid offered his unit some cold sodas. Gil said that everyone in the platoon was so hot and exhausted they instantly bought the cold drinks. I asked Gil if there was any event that stuck out during his tour. He said one time his platoon was out in the middle of this huge rice field. All of a sudden some NVA started firing at his unit from a wooded hill. But the NVA were so far out they could not get a good aim at his platoon. Gil said the bullets sounded like firecrackers going off around them. The radio operator called it in, and from the horizon this plane arrived and attacked the enemy position with napalm. The entire hill went up in flames. The gunfire didn't stop though. He said it took 5 more runs before the gunfire was finally silenced. Gil said he has never seen such an awesome display like that again. I asked Gil what were the most dangerous patrols to be on. He said sometimes his platoon had to perform mop-up duty. This was very scary because it was dangerous to go in an area where there had just been a fight. He said you never knew what to expect in a situation like that. I asked him if he had any special assignments. Gil said no, but he and his buddy were convinced that with all the fighting going on, they would not make it out of Vietnam alive. So he and his friends decided to volunteer for sapper duty. He never ended up being a sapper since Gil was wounded, and that ended the war for him. I asked him how he was wounded, and I also explained he did not have to answer the question if he did not want to. But he had no problem relating the experience. The reason I say this is it's usually considered out of line to ask a combat veteran how they were wounded unless they tell you first. So in terms of how he was wounded, there was a firefight and his unit was called in as reinforcements. His unit was loaded into 2 helicopters. These were UH-1 Huey Infantry Dispatch helicopters, and that's how a lot of platoons during the Vietnam War were transported into a hot zone. Gil was loaded up into the 2nd helicopter. Everyone in the 1st helicopter was killed from ground fire. Gil was also wounded from an NVA soldier on the ground. He remembered seeing the soldier take aim. He related it all happened very quickly. A bullet entered his right arm and exited his left shoulder. It only missed his heart by a few inches. Gil told me the dumbest thing he ever did was get off that helicopter. He could have gone back to the base camp since he was wounded. Also, the helicopter missed the landing zone and set right down between the American position and the NVA position. So Gil was stuck right in the middle of the firefight. Gil said he has never been more terrified in his life because he could not even lift his right arm. He remembered telling the guys next to him that if the NVA troops left their position, he would not be able to do anything about it. That fight lasted 2 hours. Can you imagine being stuck in the middle of that firefight for 2 hours? Gil said it seemed like an eternity. After it was all over, he was placed on a helicopter back to camp. He remembered looking around the helicopter and seeing that all of the other soldiers around him were dead. It was a scene he would never forget. Gil also related to me that fighting in Vietnam was not like the movies. He said pretty much everyone laid flat on the ground because no one wanted to get shot. No one dared lift their head. He told me that there was this one young lieutenant that kept lifting his head to look around, and everyone in the unit told him to get down, get down. One final time he did that, he was hit by a sniper right through the head. Another Vietnam vet that I had a chance to talk to was Craig. Craig also arrived after the Tet Offensive and, like Gil, was drafted into the U.S. Army. Craig told me the basic training he learned was all important. That U.S. military basic training saved his life several times in Vietnam. I asked him what he thought of the NVA soldier. Craig used one word to describe them: tough. He related that the NVA soldiers could live off a bowl of rice for a month if needed. Craig fought in the jungles near Laos. He said it rained so often that entire rivers were formed. One time he crossed one of these newly formed rivers, and when he reached the other bank, he discovered a massive green leech on his leg. He said only fire could remove these types of leeches. Craig's platoon set up ambushes in the middle of the jungle. He said they would set up 3 different zones with claymore mines. He said that if you were inside these zones, you were pretty safe, but once in a while you needed to serve in an outer patrol outside of the claymores. And according to Craig, that is where most of the deaths occurred. Okay, that's all the notes I have. I have to actually find more of the notes I have on some other interviews I've done.